Clara Bellamy buried her husband's ring in the earth above his grave, 3 years after the ranch accident that killed him. She was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with a farm she managed alone outside Willow Creek, Montana, and a town that had long ago decided what sort of woman she was. Dependable, quiet, useful. A widow who worked hard, asked for little, and was unlikely to trouble anyone with inconvenient hopes. Standing over the grave, Clara promised herself she would never again be foolish enough to expect a man to choose her. Then a stranger moved into the abandoned Harmon place, a mile and a half north of her farm. Clara baked him an apple cinnamon pie. She told herself it was only courtesy. She rolled the crust twice, spent nutmeg she could barely afford, wrapped the pie in a flour-dusted cloth, and tucked a handwritten note beneath the twine. From your neighbor to the south, hope you're settling in fine, Clara Bellamy. Nothing more. The Harmon Ranch had stood empty for 3 years, but when Clara arrived that October afternoon, smoke climbed from the chimney. Someone had repaired the porch step and replaced the latch. The man who answered her knock was tall and broad across the chest, weathered by years of outdoor work. Brown hair was beginning to gray at his temples. His jaw carried several days of rough growth, and his dark gray eyes had the exhausted caution of a man accustomed to watching the horizon for trouble. Clara Bellamy, she introduced herself. South Road. She held out the pie. The stranger reached for it and stopped when he saw the note. Something changed in his face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Then it disappeared. Everett Callahan, he said. He accepted the pie, thanked her, and unexpectedly offered coffee. Clara almost refused. Refusing invitations had become instinct after widowhood. It kept expectations manageable. Instead, she heard herself say, "All right." His cabin was plain. Bedroll, stove, table, 2 chairs, a saddlebag hanging near the door, and a bundle of papers tied carefully together. Everett poured coffee and spoke little, but Clara discovered his silence did not require rescuing. They could sit without performing for one another. He told her he had come through Kansas and Wyoming. She told him she and her husband had left Ohio 7 years earlier, and that she had been widowed for 3. "I manage fine," she said. Everett studied her as though the words mattered. "I believe you." That answer stayed with her. When she left, she noticed him standing in the doorway with her note still in his hand. "You always write like this?" he asked. "Unless somebody has invented another way of writing a note." For the second time, recognition passed across his face. Clara walked home, telling herself she had imagined it. She had not. 2 years earlier, long before Everett Callahan came to Willow Creek, Clara had gone to the post office for a package and overheard the postmaster complaining about an undeliverable letter. Its intended recipient could no longer be found. The woman who had written it had died. The postmaster intended to burn it with the other dead mail. Clara asked to read it. The letter was addressed only to a man whose name began with W. It was a simple, lonely letter about snow on a mountain, a childhood horse, and the hope that wherever he had gone, he still allowed himself to stand in sunlight. Clara could not bear the thought of it ending in a stove. She paid 11 cents to have it forwarded through the cattle route mail system. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived for her. The man called himself only W. He thanked her for forwarding the letter and explained that he had not known the woman was dead. Clara had become the only person to whom he could admit his grief. So Clara answered. She told him grief sometimes needed a witness more than advice. He wrote again. Then she did. For 2 years, their letters crossed the West. W was a cowboy who seldom stayed anywhere long. His replies came from Nevada, Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming. He wrote about rivers, cattle drives, winter camps, a gray mare named Rosie who could sense storms before men could, and the loneliness of moving so often that nowhere expected you to return. Clara wrote about her garden, her farm, winter silence, and her dead husband's terrible coffee. Eventually, she wrote about the harder things. She told W what it was like to be a large woman in a small town, where people often saw her body before her intelligence, competence, or humor. She had learned to survive being overlooked, she wrote, but sometimes she missed the idea of being seen completely. W's response came weeks later. He told her she was not asking for too much. She deserved to be seen. Clara read that letter until the folds went soft. By the time Everett arrived in Willow Creek, 47 letters from W were stored in a wooden box beneath her bed. She had never told anyone about them. She certainly did not know that the man standing in the doorway of the Harmon cabin had written every one. Everett knew almost immediately. The handwriting on the pie note had struck him like a physical blow. He had spent 2 years carrying Clara's letters in his saddlebag from trail to trail. He knew the long strokes of her letters, the way she crossed certain words, even the pressure her pen made when she was angry. He should have told her that first day. Instead, he became afraid. Clara knew W as a voice stripped of reputation and history. Everett Callahan carried history he had not yet confessed. So he waited. And the longer he waited, the harder honesty became. A week later, Clara's wagon sank into mud on South Ridge Road. Everett happened to ride past on his roan gelding, Beaumont. He dismounted without ceremony and put his shoulder against the axle. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. "I know." That mattered more than she expected. He freed the wheel, suggested she use the longer ridge road after rain, and rode away. The following Tuesday, Clara discovered fresh gravel spread over the worst part of South Ridge Road. No note. No request for thanks. She knew who had done it. Soon Everett appeared at her farm, carrying a rotten fence post. "I started repairing your south fence," he admitted, then realized I ought to have asked. "You ought to have. I'm asking now." "How many posts?" 7, maybe 8. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. Why are you doing it?" Everett considered his answer. "Because winter is coming. Because the fence needs fixing. Because you brought me pie when you didn't have to." Clara pointed toward her kitchen window. "There's apple cake inside when you finish." One corner of his mouth lifted. "That'll do." Their friendship grew by inches. Coffee after chores. Talk about horses. A repaired gate. A shared silence. Everett did not treat Clara as fragile, pitiable, or extraordinary for managing her own farm. He spoke to her as a capable adult and expected her to disagree when she disagreed. Clara had forgotten how intimate ordinary respect could feel. Mrs. Eleanor Hatch, her neighbor and Willow Creek's most efficient distributor of concern, disguised as gossip, warned her that nobody knew where Everett came from. "Most people have something they don't advertise," Clara replied. "You cannot afford another mistake. I know exactly what I can afford." What frightened Clara was not the gossip. It was that she had begun looking forward to Everett. Then one morning, Everett noticed her journal. He picked it up when it fell from the table but did not open it. "You write?" "Letters mostly." His hand stilled. "What kind?" "My sister. And someone else." "Someone else?" "A correspondence that began by accident." Everett looked down at his coffee. "I used to write letters." "To someone?" "Yes. Not anymore." A long pause. "The letters still go," he said. "I'm just not sure they're reaching the person the way they used to." Clara felt an inexplicable tightening in her chest. 4 days later, a letter arrived from W. He wrote that he had stopped moving. For the first time in years, he had found a place where staying seemed possible. There was a woman there whose kindness felt strangely familiar to him. That familiarity frightened him, because he had spent so long believing he was meant to leave every place before it could matter. Clara wrote back that perhaps staying was not about geography. Perhaps a person stayed where there was room for who he actually was. As she wrote, the face in her mind was not the imaginary stranger she had pictured for 2 years. It was Everett Callahan's. At Willow Creek's autumn gathering, the connection tightened further. Clara attended alone. Everett arrived later, visibly uncomfortable among crowds. They found each other near the wall, and stood together with the ease of two people equally relieved not to perform. Later, the townspeople persuaded Clara to read one of her poems. It had been inspired by W's story about Rosie, the storm-sensing mare. Halfway through the poem, Clara noticed Everett. He had gone completely still. Afterward, near the door, he stopped her. That poem. What about it? He struggled with something he could not yet say. Nothing. It was good. But Clara saw recognition again. That night, Everett returned alone to his cabin and opened the saddlebag containing 47 letters. There was no uncertainty left. Clara Bellamy was the woman he had known for 2 years. The woman who had told him about loneliness without shame. The woman who had believed he could become better before she ever saw his face. And he had allowed her to sit across from him without telling her. His reason was fear. Not only fear of losing her. Fear of what she would think when she learned what he had once failed to do. That past began catching up with him through Harrison Vale. Vale owned the valley's largest cattle operation and possessed the quiet influence of a man who rarely needed to make direct threats. He approached Clara outside the general store. "You know much about your new neighbor?" "Enough." "Where he came from?" "Kansas, Wyoming." "Who he worked for?" Clara's attention sharpened. "Is there a reason you care?" Vale smiled. "Community interest." "Interesting. I don't remember the community investigating you before allowing you to settle here." She walked away, but uneasiness followed her. "Everett found her on the road afterward. Vale spoke to you. It was not a question. He asked about you." Everett walked beside Beaumont for several moments before speaking. "There are things in my past I'm not proud of." "Are you dangerous?" "No." "Have you hurt people?" He looked toward the road. "I stood by when I should have stood in front of them." That answer unsettled her because it sounded familiar. So did what came next. Everett explained that he knew things about Harrison Vale's land operations, things Vale wanted buried. Days later, another letter arrived from W. For the first time, he told Clara the truth about his greatest shame. Years earlier, he had worked in Wyoming for a land operation that manipulated ownership, pressured families, and used the appearance of legality to take property from people without enough money to fight back. At first, W had ignored what he suspected because the wages were good and he was tired of instability. Then a woman with 2 children came to the camp gate and asked him for help. He promised to look into the matter. He did. Then he did nothing. Her farm was taken. He resigned 3 weeks later, but leaving did not save her. For years he had carried the knowledge that when courage had actually been required, he had failed. Clara answered him without absolving him. What he had done was wrong. But remorse without change was useless, and the man writing to her now was clearly not the same man who had stood silent years earlier. She mailed the reply. Then she went home and lay awake. The details in W's confession matched Everett's partial confession almost exactly. She remembered Everett recognizing her handwriting, his reaction to the poem, the saddlebag, the bundle of papers, the pauses. By morning she knew. She waited. 3 days later, Everett came to her door with his hat in his hands. "I need to tell you something." "Then tell me." "The note on your pie. I recognized your handwriting." Clara did not move. "I've known it for 2 years." He forced himself to finish. "I'm W." Silence filled the kitchen. Then Clara said, "I know." Everett stared. "Since when?" 3 nights ago." He looked almost relieved until she continued. "Understanding why you were afraid does not make what you did right." "No. I told you things in those letters I have never told another living person. I could do that because W was far away, safe. Then suddenly the man who knew every private thought I had was sitting at my table without telling me." "I know. You knew me before I knew you knew me." "Yes. That matters." "Yes." He did not defend himself. That helped, but not enough. "I never lied in the letters," he said. "Everything I wrote was true. I know your letters, Everett. Then you know what you mean to me." Her anger faltered, but she would not let emotion erase the breach. I need time. I know. I'm not saying no. He nodded. At the doorway, he turned. The letters were already the most important thing in my life before I knew your face, before the pie, before any of this. I need you to know that. Then he left. Clara pulled the wooden box from beneath her bed and reread all 47 letters. She did not search for romance. She searched for evidence of character. What she found was inconsistency, regret, humor, fear, stubbornness, and honesty. Everett had withheld his identity after discovering hers, and that mattered. Yet across 2 years he had never asked her to become smaller for him, never mocked her vulnerability, never manipulated her loneliness. Before he knew what she looked like, he had already told her she deserved to be seen. Before he knew she lived nearby, she had already become the person he wanted to tell when something beautiful happened. By evening, Clara understood 2 things simultaneously. She was not ready to forgive him completely, and Harrison Vale was dangerous. She walked north. Everett was in the barn. I'm not here to forgive you yet. Understood. I'm here because Vale knows enough about your past to be frightened. If he's frightened, he'll move. Everett's expression changed. Clara sat on a low stool. Tell me everything, and do not remove the embarrassing parts. So he did. Everett's father had worked cattle his entire life and died broke at 53, still believing honest labor would eventually be rewarded. Everett had sworn he would not live the same way. That hunger for stability led him to steady, well-paid work inside the Wyoming land operation connected to Harrison Vale's family. He had suspected something was wrong before he proved it. That, he told Clara, was part of his shame. Suspecting allowed him to pretend he did not know. Eventually, he saw altered surveys, coerced agreements, and families forced from property. The woman who came to the gate was named Margaret Frerydead. He had never forgotten her face. After leaving the operation, Everett secretly kept copies of business correspondence, payment records, and notes documenting what he had witnessed. 7 years later, while passing through Montana, he recognized Harrison Vale, using versions of the same tactics against local ranchers. That was why Everett stopped traveling. For once, instead of riding away from wrongdoing, he stayed. Where are the records? Clara asked. My saddlebag. Move them. Where? My house. No, that was not a request. Clara, you don't get to decide which risks I'm allowed to take. I'm not putting you in danger. The danger already exists. I'm choosing what I do with it. She leaned forward. Let me actually help you, not because I pity you, not because I'm in love with you, because what Vale is doing is wrong, and I can do something useful. Everett looked at her for a long time. All right? She hid the business records beneath W's 47 letters. Evidence of the man Everett had once been, and evidence of the man he had become, now occupied the same wooden box. Vale's first move was small. One of Everett's horses disappeared from a latched corral. Sheriff Bradley suggested the mare had wandered. Everett knew better. Then Eli Marsh rode into town. Marsh had worked with the Wyoming operation. He filed a sworn statement claiming Everett had deliberately burned a supply depot near Laramie 3 years earlier to avoid paying a debt. The accusation was fabricated, but it created something Vale understood very well, an official story. Clara went straight to Everett. He tried to send her home. She refused. The moment I carried those papers into my house, I became part of this. Stop trying to decide when I'm allowed to participate. Everett finally surrendered the instinct to protect her by excluding her. He told her about Judge Alderman, a regional circuit judge investigating land fraud across several counties. If Alderman received the old correspondence, it could transform Everett from accused drifter into material witness. They sent critical documents toward Billings with Cole Garrett, a stage company rider Everett trusted. Then Vale attacked Clara. A woman named Ruth Sperry arrived at her gate carrying a warning. A widow with a farm depended on community goodwill, and goodwill could disappear. The message also implied Everett might see Clara merely as useful. That struck exactly where Vale intended. Clara had spent years being told, directly or indirectly, that a woman with her body and circumstances should be grateful for whatever attention she received. For several minutes, old doubt returned. Then she opened the box beneath her bed. 47 letters answered Vale more convincingly than reassurance could. A man using her for convenience would not have written to her for 2 years before knowing her face. Clara closed the box. She had work to do. The hearing against Everett was scheduled for Friday. There was little time. Clara identified 2 local families harmed by Vale, the Roars and the Ashworths. Donald and May Roar had lost 40 acres when a long-standing survey boundary was quietly redrawn. Jacob Ashworth's family had endured years of financial pressure and implied threats. Everett doubted they would risk speaking publicly. Clara went anyway. At the Roar kitchen table, she did not promise safety. She told them the truth. Everett possessed documents. A judge might become involved. Vale was trying to destroy him before those records could be examined. May Roar looked at her husband, then at Clara. "My father built every fence on this place," she agreed to testify. The Ashworths were afraid but willing if others stood with them. By sunset, Clara had 2 families prepared to speak. On the road home, 2 riders appeared behind her. They delivered Vale's next warning more openly. He knew whom she had visited. People who interfered faced consequences, especially women who lived alone. Clara kept her horse walking at the same pace. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her run. Only after reaching home did she allow herself 2 minutes to be frightened. Then she wrote Everett a note. Vale was watching her now. That changed tactics, not purpose. Wednesday morning, Everett arrived at her farm, riding Beaumont hard. Cole Garrett had reached Judge Alderman. More importantly, Alderman had already been investigating Harrison Vale's operation for 4 months. Everett's records were the missing inside evidence. Alderman was coming to Willow Creek. Vale, however, made another move before the hearing. Declan Crisp arrived. Crisp had been a fixer for the Wyoming operation, a man skilled not at inventing lies, but at rearranging truth. Soon Willow Creek heard that Everett had a history of attaching himself to vulnerable widows. Mrs. Hatch reluctantly brought the rumor to Clara. A widow in Colorado, people were saying, had once been targeted by him. Everett heard the conversation. Again he offered Clara an escape. Again she refused it. "Every time you tell me I can step away, what I hear is that you still don't trust me to know my own mind." He stopped. "Understood. Good. Now tell me about the Colorado widow." Her name was Martha Dunar. Everett had repaired her property after her husband died. She had fed him while he worked. He had refused normal wages. Crisp had seen enough to describe all of that truthfully while allowing listeners to imagine exploitation. Clara recognized the strategy immediately. A fact could not defeat Crisp. A witness could. She wrote to Martha. Meanwhile, she returned to the Roars and Ashworths and convinced both families to attend the Friday hearing publicly with their records. By Thursday, Judge Alderman was in Willow Creek. Everett needed the remaining documents delivered without Vale's watchers following him. Clara hid the wooden box beneath jars of preserves in a market basket and took the Ridge Road into town. At the hotel, Alderman's clerk, Thomas Hale, accepted the evidence and unexpectedly brought Clara upstairs to meet the judge. Alderman wanted to know who had organized 2 witness families in less than 48 hours. Clara told him what she had personally observed: Vale's questions, the threats at her gate, the riders on the road, the manipulated Roar survey, and Crisp's methods. Alderman listened. Then he explained what Friday would actually become. Sheriff Bradley would begin the local hearing against Everett. Marsh and Crisp would present their claims. Then Alderman would invoke his authority over the broader land fraud investigation. If Everett's documents survived scrutiny, Harrison Vale was not merely going to lose a dispute. His operation could collapse. As Clara left the hotel, Harrison Vale stopped her on the street. For once, his polished manner was gone. He reminded her that she was a widow with a small farm, no powerful family, and little money. "What exactly do you think protects you?" he asked. Clara looked at him calmly. "I understand what you think you can take from me." She paused. "But men like you make the same mistake over and over. You look at people and calculate what they don't have." Vale stared at her. "You never look long enough to discover what they do." She walked away. Only after turning the corner did she let herself breathe. That evening, Everett sat on her porch steps beneath the immense November sky. Neither spoke for a while. Then he told her something he had been trying not to say. He had been alone long before he became a wandering cowboy. He had known loneliness in crowded rooms, in camps and towns and jobs where everyone knew his name but nobody knew him. Then Clara's letters had begun arriving. For 2 years, he had not been alone. "I don't know what happens tomorrow," he said. "I don't know if Vale has another move, but that hearing isn't the thing I'm most afraid of losing." Clara turned toward him. He started to remind her she had asked for time. "Stop talking." He did. "I know who you are, Everett. I knew most of you before I knew your face." She looked toward the dark road between their farms. "I have spent years preparing for bad things, because I thought that was the same as being sensible. I forgot that sometimes you have to stand inside something good and allow it to be good." She met his eyes. "This is good." Everett became very still. "Yeah," he said softly, "it is." Friday morning, Willow Creek Church filled before 9. The Roars arrived carrying their original survey documents. The Ashworths sat 3 rows back. Harrison Vale took a front seat. Eli Marsh and Declan Crisp waited to testify. Everett entered alone, clean-shaven, and composed. He did not look toward Clara as he took his place. She understood. He needed to stand publicly as himself. But as she watched him, she thought of every letter. "You are not alone." Marsh testified first. He described the Laramie Depot fire with impressive detail. Then Everett stood. He had not been in Laramie during the period Marsh named. He had been working a cattle contract in Cheyenne. Signed Henderson Company records, delivery logs and correspondence proved his location week by week. Marsh visibly faltered. Crisp did not. He spoke next. He mentioned Everett's constant movement, his habit of appearing around vulnerable properties, and the Colorado widow. Every individual fact was technically true. Together they created a lie. Clara could feel the room beginning to accept the implication. Then Sheriff Bradley asked whether anyone wished to speak for Everett. Clara stood. 80 faces turned toward the large widow from South Road, who had spent years perfecting the art of being present without occupying too much space. She no longer cared about that art. "My name is Clara Bellamy," she said, "and there are facts this room has not heard." She produced Martha Dunar's reply. Martha confirmed Everett had spent 3 weeks repairing her property after her husband's death. He had refused wages. The only money she forced upon him was $1 toward replacing boots he had worn through working for her. She considered the suggestion that he had exploited her insulting. Crisp's carefully constructed implication collapsed. Then Clara addressed her own role in his story. "Yes, Everett Callahan repaired my fence. He pulled my wagon from mud. He helped me when I needed another pair of hands." She let her gaze move across the church. "Not one of those things was forced on me. Not one came with conditions. I am not a woman who was taken advantage of. I am a woman who was treated with respect." "Those are not the same thing." The room changed. May Rohr stood next. She described the stolen 40 acres and placed the original surveys on Bradley's table. Jacob Ashworth followed, his voice rough with fear but steady enough to continue. He described how Vale's pressure worked, not as a single dramatic crime, but through offers that were not really offers, warnings that were not quite threats, and the slow constriction of a family's choices. Then the church door opened. Judge Alderman entered. He walked to the front, took jurisdiction over the matter, and told the room that he had spent 4 months investigating land fraud across the region. The records Everett preserved for 7 years matched evidence already gathered elsewhere. The Rohr and Ashworth testimony corroborated the pattern. Correspondence connected Harrison Vale with the scheme. Eli Marsh's sworn accusation, contradicted by employment records, was now potential perjury. When Crisp attempted to speak, Alderman stopped him. The proceeding was now part of a federal investigation. Every word would go on record. Crisp sat down. Then Alderman turned to Everett. He did not erase the past to make the moment easier. 7 years earlier, Everett had failed to act when Margaret Freridid needed him. That remained true. But another truth existed beside it. Everett had preserved evidence at personal risk for 7 years. That evidence had now made it possible for multiple families to challenge a system designed to make them feel powerless. Both truths belonged to him. Neither canceled the other. Everett nodded. "That's all I wanted," he said, "for the record to be true." Before noon, the local hearing was closed and the federal inquiry had begun. Vale sat silent. Crisp disappeared before most people realized he had left. Marsh remained behind, staring at the table, perhaps understanding too late that he had been paid to stand on the wrong side of a story that now had witnesses. Donald Rohr shook Clara's hand. May hugged her. The Ashworths thanked her without needing many words. When the church was almost empty, Everett came to stand beside Clara. "Alderman wants my full testimony Monday. You'll give it?" "Everything." "Even the bad parts?" "Especially those." She nodded. Everett looked at her. "Martha Dunar. I wrote to her. You found a stranger in Colorado because Crisp used her to discredit me. I wrote because she had the right to say what happened to her in her own words." Everett made a sound almost like a laugh. Then his expression softened. "I know you asked for time. I did. Have you had enough?" Clara thought of the grave where she had buried a ring, the pie, the first note, 11 cents in postage, 47 letters, the muddy road, the repaired fence, the lie of omission she had not simply excused, the apology Everett had not demanded she accept, the evidence he had carried for 7 years, the porch beneath the November sky, the church, and the realization that for years she had mistaken being underestimated for being unworthy. "Yes," she said. "I've had enough time." Everett reached for her hand. He did not pull. He simply offered his. Clara placed hers in it. The federal inquiry lasted 3 more months. Harrison Vale had money, lawyers, and decades of practice surviving consequences, so nothing ended as neatly as the Friday hearing had made it appear. But the documents held. Everett testified without protecting his reputation. He admitted accepting money from the Wyoming operation. He admitted suspecting wrongdoing before he investigated. He admitted failing Margaret when courage would have mattered most. Then he gave investigators every name, date, conversation, and document he remembered. By February, Vale's operation was dissolved. 3 fraudulent land transfers were reversed. Survey records were corrected across 2 counties. Eli Marsh faced a perjury charge. Families who had watched pieces of their property disappear on paper recovered what belonged to them. Federal investigators eventually located Margaret Freridid in Nebraska. She received formal acknowledgement of what had happened and compensation from the resulting settlement. Everett sent her a personal letter. The postage cost 11 cents. Clara never asked what he wrote. She understood why some letters belonged only to the people who sent and received them. Spring returned slowly to Willow Creek. The Rohrs began inviting Clara to supper. The Ashworths stopped looking over their shoulders quite so often. Even Mrs. Hatch appeared one morning with plum preserves and an uncomfortable expression. "I was wrong about him." Clara waited. Eleanor sighed. "And probably about you. That must have hurt." It did. Clara opened the door wider. "Coffee?" The town never formally apologized to Everett. Towns seldom did. Acceptance appeared through smaller gestures. Men stopped him on the street to talk cattle. Sheriff Bradley shook his hand while looking him directly in the eye. The general store began keeping his preferred coffee in stock. More importantly, Everett stopped behaving like Willow Creek was another temporary camp. He repaired the Harmon place as though he expected to see next winter from the same porch. He built shelves, planted posts, bought seed, made plans that extended beyond the next month. He was learning how to stay. Clara was learning something equally difficult: how to let someone stay without waiting for the day she would be proven foolish. One April morning, she opened her door and found an envelope wedged against the frame. No stamp, no postmark, only her name, written in the large, slightly uneven handwriting she had known long before she knew Everett's face. She carried it to the kitchen table. The letter was short. Everett wrote that he had spent 2 years sending words to her across enormous distances and had discovered he did not know how to write to a woman who lived only a mile away. So he would be direct. He wanted to court her properly. Not because he thought Clara needed convincing. Not because public approval mattered more than what existed between them. Because he wanted to choose her openly. Dinner at Mercer's. Walks on Ridge Road. Visits that were called visits instead of excuses about fences. Whatever respectable courtship looked like in Montana in 1887. Most of all, he wanted her to understand that the choice had not begun with the pie. He had chosen her before he knew her face. At the bottom he added that the coffee was on. Clara read the letter twice. Then she put on her good brown boots. She walked north. Everett was already standing on his porch when she came through the gate. "You were watching for me," she said. "Yes. I walked. You couldn't have heard a wagon." "No." She considered making him suffer longer. Instead, she held up the letter. "Dinner at Mercer's is acceptable." "Good. But I've been properly courted before. People exaggerate its virtues." Everett came down the steps. "I'm not aiming for impressive." "What are you aiming for?" "Honest." Clara looked at him. 11 cents. 47 letters. A pie wrapped in cloth. A winter barn. A woman at a gate Everett had once failed. A box of documents he had carried because some part of him still hoped his failure might someday be turned toward repair. A church full of people. A man who told the truth, even when it damaged the version of himself he wished he could have been. A woman who finally understood that being overlooked had never meant she was invisible. "Honest is good," Clara said. Everett offered his hand. She took it. They went inside for coffee. There was no grand declaration, no promise that pain had vanished, no fantasy that love had erased their histories. Everett would always remember Margaret. Clara would always remember her husband, and the years when grief had taught her to make herself smaller than she was. The breach of trust between Clara and Everett had not disappeared simply because she loved him. It had been repaired through confession, boundaries, time, and the steady proof that when she said no, wait, or let me decide, Everett listened. That mattered. Their love was not a rescue. Clara had saved her farm before Everett. Everett had survived the trail before Clara. What neither had known how to do was live fully while being known. That was what the letters had given them. First, at a distance. Then, face to face. Clara Bellamy had once buried a ring and promised herself she would never again believe she could be chosen. She had misunderstood the lesson. The danger had never been believing in love. The danger was believing other people's measurements of her worth. Everett had spent 7 years believing remorse required him to remain in motion forever. He had misunderstood his lesson too. Punishment was not the same as accountability. Leaving was not the same as changing. Sometimes change meant staying long enough to face what followed. By spring, the road between their farms no longer felt like a distance. It was simply a road they both knew how to walk. And the story that had begun with a dead woman's undeliverable letter became something neither Clara nor Everett could have planned. 2 lonely people telling the truth to someone they could not see, long before either understood that the person listening would someday live close enough to share coffee. Before Everett knew Clara's body, he knew her mind. Before Clara knew Everett's face, she knew his regrets. And after they learned everything else, the omissions, mistakes, fears, histories and scars, they still chose to remain. Not blindly. Not because loneliness made any company better than none. With full knowledge, that was the difference. That was the healing. Clara had wanted someone who saw the rest of her before deciding what her body meant. Everett had wanted someone who could see the worst thing he had done without pretending it was good and still believe he was capable of becoming better. They found those things in each other. Not through magic. Through 47 letters, 11 cents, an apple cinnamon pie, and the ordinary courage of telling the truth to someone who was willing to listen.